on quality of water in Ukraine. And we are happy to welcome all the participants, and we are so happy that you are joining us. Today, we have a no less interesting than before and a no less interesting lecture. We will hear from Lisa. Oh, and before that, as ever, I'd like to say a couple of words of introduction that we usually share at the beginning of our training. And also, it will make it possible for other people to connect without missing any important information. So our training is being implemented in the framework of the same name project, Best Management Practices of the Forest Service of the US and the Quality of Water in Ukraine. Financing is supported by the Forest Service of the US. This is the Department of Agriculture. And the organizers are FORSA NGO and the Forest Service of the US. This is quite an extensive part of the organizational work and efforts has been undertaken by the Forest Service of the US. And today we have representatives of the service at the training with us, and we are very grateful to them. So we've planned 6 webinars. We have already covered 2, and we have listened to this. We have received this information. Today we will speak about forest harvesting. And you can see the topics of the next seminars, webinars. Each time you can see them. And of course, they are as interesting and as all the previous webinars. Today, the structure is going to be a bit different because Lisa is going to present quite a substantial amount of information. So we decided not to cut it down because there is a lot of interesting stuff. So we decided to leave as much time for the presentation as possible. So today we will take 1 hour for the presentation, and rest of the time it will be Q&A and the quiz if we have any time left for the quiz. If not, the second hour of the webinar will be focused on discussion and on Q&A. And here I'd like to express gratitude to my 2 colleagues, to Oleg Taranivsky and Yuri Verbal, who were very helpful editing the Ukrainian version of the presentation because the topic is obviously very specific and contains a lot of specific terminology. And I'm grateful to these people. And our rules now. So traditionally, we will take a family photo after this introduction. I will ask you all to start your video. And actually, if you do have a stable connection, please keep your video on, because this is about eye contact. When we organize offline activities, we have this experience of seeing other people's eyes. So let's try and reproduce it here. But if your internet connection is poor, of course, you can stop your video. And we ask you to mute your microphones unless you are going to say something to the audience. To ask questions, you can use the chat box, or there are these emojis that you can also use. Here we have them in the instrument panel, and you can have some drink, some beverage at hand to comfortably follow the webinar. If it is your first time at the webinar, let me just emphasize that we have interpretation going. You need to choose the glow button in the bottom of your screen and pick up the channel, language channel that you need. English, Ukrainian, or off. You can also just follow the original of the discussion. And I believe that's it on my side. If I've forgotten to mention anything, I believe that Lisa will And so now I suggest that we take our family photo. Please start your video.
Чекайте секундочку.
Wait a second. Yes, look at yourself in the picture. If you like yourselves, do your hair a little bit. So Leslie is taking photos.
Посмішка.
Smile.
Дякую.
Thank you. We can continue now. Thank you. And then we pass the floor to Ms. Lisa Bow and a presentation of forest harvesting methods. The floor is yours. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the honor of being here this morning for me, but afternoon for you guys. Anytime I have a chance to talk about logging systems, I'm always excited. So I'm happy to be having this conversation with you this afternoon. Let me get my presentation started here. That looking good?
Yes, it works fine.
Perfect. Thank you. So yes, I'm Lisa Ball. I'm the National Logging Systems Specialist with the U.S. Forest Service. So I spend most of my time doing trainings to other Forest Service people about logging systems and helping answer questions or situations as things comes up for people inside the U.S. Forest Service. Today, I'm going to walk you through a short journey of the history of logging systems on the Forest Service, and then switch over to talk about some of the current logging systems that we use today. And the second half of the presentation, I'm really going to dive deeper into a newer technology that's been out for just about a decade, that's really starting to take off, and we're viewing as a big logging system that will be taking over into the future for us. So with that, welcome. So first, the US is a big country, and each area kind of has its own history, its own logging systems that work best in that area based off of topography and culture and tree species. So last week, if you were here, Tom was talking about private lands over here on the East Coast. And I'm going to be covering basically the opposite. The green is the public lands, mostly owned by the Forest Service. And so this is the area that I'm going to be talking about. This is the area where I've spent my career. So this is the area I know, all on public lands in the West. There are some similarities to the Carpathian Mountains with the steep slopes, although it is somewhat different mountains than what you might be used to experiencing in Ukraine. So I'm going to be talking about the Pacific Northwest, which is what we call this area here, and then the West. So we started over here, coming from Europe. This is where settlement started. So this area is called the West, and then this is the Pacific Northwest. So it's a little confusing because West is not actually the farthest west. So the Pacific Northwest is a temperate rainforest, getting a lot of moisture coming off the Pacific Ocean. And so there can be 150 to 400 centimeters of rain annually. It has cold, wet winters. So a lot of the rain turns to snow at the higher elevations, around 1,000 meters. So below that is rain and above that is snow, followed by warm, dry summers. It's volcanic in origin, and a lot of our mountains are still considered active volcanoes, although the last major eruption was 40 years ago. And it's mostly coniferous trees, Douglas fir, cedars, and hemlocks. The west, because it's farther inland, is a little bit drier. Depending on where you are, ranging from 25 to 250 centimeters of rainfall, has a lot colder winters, in part because it's higher elevation, in part because it's away from the ocean. It's also volcanic in nature. It has a little bit more mixed species, pines and hardwoods. So settlement in this area started in the 1800s. And in the late 1800s to early 1900s, the West was dominated by old growth forests. These forests were harvested with axes and cross-cut saws, as you see here. And the timber was hauled away using rivers or trains, or sometimes using animals to drag the logs. This is a bit before my time, so I'm not going to go too deeply into this, other than to say that because of how access was and logging was and the technology at the time, all the roads and access points are from the bottom of the hill down by the rivers. A lot of our old original roads are built right next to the rivers or crossing the rivers, which still is impacting water quality and how we manage these roads into today. So for the first several decades of the, before I get into this, I just want to say, if you have questions as I'm going through, please feel free to put them in the chat and someone will translate them for me or ask a question, because I don't want you to be confused, and there could easily be some, as she mentioned, unique terms that translation might be a little challenging. So if you have questions, please speak up as we go through. All right. So, as I was saying, the first several decades, there was not that much harvest happening on Forest Service lands. This is timber harvested on Forest Service lands. And up through 1940, not a lot of harvest was happening. But after World War II, harvest levels started going up. Part of that was demand for new homes after the war. Also, private lands had been logged fairly extensively by that time, so there was more push to get into the federal lands to harvest that timber. And so they started cutting more heavily on our Forest Service lands. So after World War II, up to about the 1980s, chainsaws really started taking off. So instead of crosscut saws or axes, there was now chainsaws, and that made logging much more efficient, much faster. And transportation switched away from railroad to roads and using trucks. So during this time, there were basically two main ways that timber was being removed. Chainsaws with a skidder, you can see here, which is a ground machine that will pick up the logs and drag them, or chainsaws with a yarder in what we call a cable system, where you have a tower and you have wire rope, and this goes out into the woods, grabs the trees and drags them back to the road. So the yarder stays at the road, dragging logs in with cables, where the skidder goes out into the unit to grab the logs and bring them into the landing. In the 1980s, there was a switch to doing less and less cutting on using chainsaws, and slopes where it would allow, about under 40%, felling turned over to feller bunchers. So this machine will go out and it can cut trees, and it can hold, can cut a tree, hold it, cut another tree, and they can hold up to 10 trees while still collectively and collecting and cutting more trees. So we call this a feller buncher. It then places bunches of trees that makes skidding very efficient. So it's more efficient. It's also a lot safer. So the logging, at least in the US, is always the #1 or #2 most dangerous job. And cutting the trees with chainsaws is definitely one of the more hazardous jobs. And so being able to put the worker inside of the machine versus cutting with a chainsaw improves worker safety significantly, as well as increasing productivity and reducing costs. There was also, during this 1980s, a lot of yarders were being built just for logging. There was a lot of innovation with logging. They started doing more helicopter logging. They experimented with using hot air balloons to do logging. There was a lot of inventions happening here in the 80s. And then we come into the 90s. Up through the 80s, a lot of the harvest was still old growth. But in the 90s, there was a big public pushback, and there was a lot of concerns being raised about logging practices, especially around the cutting of old growth and what that means for wildlife that depends on the old growth forests and fish and just the whole ecosystem of that old growth forest. So a lot of new regulations came into effect, and you see there was a significant drop in our harvest volumes between 1990 and 2000, where it has basically plateaued since then. Because volumes dropped so much and we shifted away from high value old growth to younger stands, the loggers needed to really be as efficient as possible in their logging in order to stay in business. And so harvests stopped on the areas, especially in the west, with low rainfall and slow tree growth. Those areas stopped being harvested because it was too costly to get those areas. And so yarders with the tower system went away in a lot of areas. The trees weren't economical enough to justify that logging system. And so now in those areas, there are no yarders left. There are no people who know how to use that system and are trained up on it, because it does require some specialized knowledge. And now we have wildfire concerns and want to treat those areas to reduce the risk of wildfire. And so the challenge is, these were areas that were cable logged. That tool is not available anymore. So how are we going to treat those areas? And that's where at the end of my presentation, the tool we're looking at is tethered logging. But we'll get there here in a little bit. So systems in use today, we have what we call mechanical full tree, where we have the feller buncher with a rubber tired skidder. So as I showed the picture of the feller buncher, the machine that will cut multiple trees at once, paired with the skidder that goes out into the woods, grabs the logs and brings them back to the road. Cable systems are still used a lot in some areas where the trees have a higher value. And so there are still some yarders out there and loggers who use that equipment. Another thing, or another system that came out and started to become more popular in the 90s is called a cut to length system. And I will be going more in depth in all of these here in just a moment. But a cut to length system has a harvester, which will cut the trees and process them into logs out in the woods, and a forwarder that will carry them back to the road. We also have a system that we call shovels that pick up the logs and place them closer and closer to the landing. So let's look a little more in depth at these ones. So ground-based systems, again, that's going to be our mechanical full tree, our cut to length, and our shovel systems are all considered ground-based. So mechanical whole tree, trees are cut with the feller buncher. We take the whole tree to the road, and then those limbs are removed at the road and the tops, and they are cut into logs before being put on a log truck. It is the main system used in the United States, and it usually is on slopes of less than 40%. With this system, all the tops and limbs are left at the landing, which has its good and bad, because if you are worried about wildfire, you don't want those out in the woods causing wildfire concerns. But it also means you have a large pile of slash at the landing that you need to manage. And it does remove some of those nutrients from the soils. The mechanical whole tree system is very cost efficient. It's also very safe because your loggers are in equipment cabs the whole time. You have a person in the feller buncher and one in the skidder, and there are a lot of regulations that go into how those cabs are designed in terms of safety, if something falls on them or if they were to roll over. And as I mentioned, all of the slash ends up at the road. The cut to length. Oh, sorry. I'll switch over. Okay. Oh. So directional fellers are basically a feller buncher. They just don't, they can only cut one tree at a time. They don't process the logs. All that is done at the road. But putting them in piles really increases that skidding efficiency. They can be tracked or wheeled. They can have what we call a boom, or basically an arm or a nut. And they can, what we do say is leveling, where the track is at one angle and the cab stays level. And you'll see that in some of the tracked machines. This allows them to go on steeper slopes. The skidders drag whole trees from where the tree was cut to the road. They also can be rubber tired or tracked. And most commonly, they use a grapple to grab the trees, because it's displayed in these pictures. So the mechanical whole tree is the probably the cheapest logging system that we have, and it's the most common in part for that reason. But there are also cut to length systems out there. And so the cut to length system consists of a harvester, as you see in the bottom picture. The harvester is going to cut the tree, remove all the branches and the tops out in the woods, and create a pile of logs out in the woods. When it does that, it creates slash. This slash is good because the harvester will walk on that slash. This reduces the soil impacts, specifically soil compaction and runoff after operations have concluded. The forwarder will then go and grab these logs and carry them back to the road, to the landing. So that slash mat that the harvester creates reduces soil compaction, especially in wet soils. It causes very little residual stand damage, so it doesn't hurt the trees that are left. And it works very well when you have a lot of trees left. This is a stand after the harvester has gone through, and there's still a lot of trees left in the stand that needed to be protected. Harvesters can also be tracked or wheeled. As I mentioned, it cuts the trees, delimbs them. These can also generally go to 40 or 50%, although some of the newer models are specifically designed to go up to 75% with a winched tether, as we'll talk about later. And you get fully processed and sorted logs out in the woods to take to the landing. So here's an example of one of the machines working on some steep ground here near where I live. The forwarder, the logs are carried free and clear of the ground. They're not dragged like you see with a skidder. The machine has its own grapple and will load itself with the logs. It does only handle shorter logs, so 5 to 8 meter long logs, compared to the skidder, which is bringing out full trees that might be 30 meters or more in length. But they do stay on that same splash mat created by the harvester, which again reduces the soil impacts. And because you have logs, not trees, cut at the road, they don't require much of a landing at all. They can just drive up and place the logs next to the road to be hauled away. So when we're designing a cut to length system, one of the main things is these machines, especially the forwarders, do not go on a side very well. They will tend to roll, so they need to go straight up and down the hill. These forwarders can also carry a lot more than your skidders, and so we make less passes going back and forth, which also helps to reduce soil impacts. So last ground-based system I'm going to talk about is what we call the shovel system. And in this system, the tree has been cut and the machine picks up a log and kind of moves it closer to the road. And it does that for all the logs it can reach. It moves forward a little bit and it does the same thing. So it's just picking up logs and placing them closer to the landing. And they'll do that several times until they reach the road. Sometimes they have a saw in this head, and so they can both cut the tree and also move it closer to the road for operations. This system is often done when you have wet sites, because where you really don't want a machine going back and forth, because it's only making one pass and it's moving very slowly and it's lifting the logs. It causes probably the least amount of soil disturbance. It also works well for relatively short distances. If you have a road and you have a stream and you have 100 to 150 meters that you want to treat on some steeper slopes, it's a good system for that. The soil impacts are reduced because the machine only makes that one pass. It makes a pass about every 15 meters. It's a tool for clear cuts because, as you can see, it's picking up the log and moving them. If you have existing trees, they tend to get hit a lot, which causes damage. It also slows down the shovel operation, and so your productivity goes down. It is only viable for short distances, about 150 meters. Let's see, and technically you can go farther than 150 meters, but it's going to cost more and it's going to slow down the operation. But compared to cable yarding, it is quite cost effective, especially for those shorter distances. Again, it is mostly a clear cut operation, although it can be used if you have few residual trees left in your unit. This is also sometimes used in swamps where they will go out into the swamp and move the logs over to basically a road made of trees that the skidder will operate on. So that was what I had for ground-based systems. That's a good stopping point if anyone has any questions on that topic area. Nope. Okay, great. Then we will.
Є запитання в чаті, Наталка.
There is a question in the chat. What is the proportion of the approach where you cut all the trees in the territory? So what's the proportion of this whole sowing approach? Maybe you have this information.
On Forest Service ground, not very much because of the public has a lot of input into how the national forests are managed, the ones owned by the federal government. So there's not much clear cuts where we cut all the trees. On private land, it is the main method out in the West and the Pacific Northwest. So the private ground will cut all the trees as their normal practice. The federal lands, we do very little.
Дякую за відповідь. У нас тим
Thank you
часом
for your answer. Meanwhile, well, Natalia, maybe I could ask 2 questions. Just a second. Let me read another question that we have in the chat, and then we can proceed with your questions, if you don't mind. So how do you dispose of cutting remains in order to reduce fire danger, fire risks?
Our main method is we burn it. So we bring it to a landing, we get a big pile going, and then we burn it. We are looking at other options. Sometimes we can sell it to people who want small, chip materials, but that market goes up and down on if there's demand for that or not. We have been exploring some new technology called an air curtain burner to try to burn the material in such a way that it causes less pollution to go into the atmosphere. But for now, the most cost-effective method is to just burn it.
Я тільки хотіла, можливо, той, хто задав запитання,
me just
Лісі пояснити, як
mention
відбувається.
the author of the question maybe could explain to Lisa how we do that if you are interested in exchanging this experience. Evhen, would you like to explain that, comment on that?
I would love to hear.
Пане Євгеній, якщо
So,
як
Evhen,
розкажіть в двох словах,
if
як
you
це
could
відбувається?
briefly address how we do that, maybe that would be interesting for colleagues, for Lisa. Yes, hello, good afternoon. Us recently, we don't have one most popular method on disposing of cutting remains. Usually, logging is done in winter, where it is possible to burn quite actively the remains. However, some people, they prefer, of course, mitigating the impact on the environment, and thus they suggest that we just leave the remains behind so that we could preserve the environment and for other like insects or forest animals for them to use those. Okay, thank you, Evhen. That's interesting. And I believe, Natalia, that I can go ahead with my 3 questions by now. One of them goes to Evhen. Evhen, which region do you mean? Well, this is forest steppe part of Kharkiv region. Then I would recommend you to answer this question in this way, that there are actually cutting rules and standards, and there are set regulations on what we do with cutting remains. Usually we actually cut these remains into smaller pieces and distribute, and or it may be piling, and the remains are kept in piles. In the recent decades, we do not burn actually the remains. Okay, thank you, Volodymyr, for that comment. And you had 2 more questions to Lisa, right? Yes, now with my 2 questions. First, approximately, of course, I understand you have no concrete figures, but what would be the percentage of wheel equipment and tracking equipment, trailing equipment? I mean, what is the percentage of wheel equipment?
So the areas I've talked about that I spend most of my career in, I would say it is 90% or more tracked feller bunchers, and then 80 to 90% wheeled skidders. So it's everything is mostly cut with a tracked system and then removed with a wheeled system. Other parts of the country, it's all wheeled machines. Some places might have a little bit of all tracked, but where I'm at, everything's cut with the tracked machine and skidded with a wheeled machine.
Тобто ніякі екоактивісти не
And
ставлять вам
eco activists do not raise that issue that you use tracked equipment in this difficult landscape.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the public doesn't think much about what tools we use for the logging. They're more concerned with what trees we cut versus what trees we leave. And usually the tracked machines cause less soil impacts than our wheeled ones.
Дякую. На жаль, мені це приходилось доказувати.
Thank
15
you for your answer. Unfortunately, I had to prove this fact to our civil society 15 years ago.
Друге питання.
And I have a second question. What is approximate average of the harvesting with the use of machines only?
So harvesting with machine instead of chainsaw.
Instead of manual labor, as he said.
In the West,
Forwarder without hand work.
so in the West, on slopes less than 40%, it's almost all cut by machine. Tom was saying in his area, they still have a lot of manual
Це
cutting.
механізація, а я балакаю за машинізацію. Тобто, де людина управляє.
Володимир Леонідович, не
Бажаний
поспішайте, не поспішайте, будь ласка, дайте Лізі закінчити відповідь, тому що в нас переклад трошечки втрачається час, і треба оцей от момент дочекатися, добре?
The moderator asked the participant to make some space for translation. So go on, please.
Okay, so it's out west, almost all cut by machine on slopes less than 40%.
Добре, дякую.
Відповіли.
Okay, thank you.
Володимир Леонідович, треба щось уточнити.
Would you like to clarify anything else? Or did you get the answer?
Машини, де люди сидять в кабінах машин,
So,
так?
And anyway, I'm asking
Чекайте переклад.
about the machines which still envisage operators. So operators are operating these machines. Are there any machines without manual labor at all? Like a remote mode?
Where people stay in cabin, in the machine, inside of the machine.
Stay inside the machine, yes.
And
Feller bunchers, skidders, harvesters, forwarders, shovels, all of those. Basically, no one is getting out of machine. It's all done in machine.
Мгм.
No, I'm sorry. I think that the question is about a remote operation.
Ні, все вірно, Володимир Леонідович. Це там, де люди не виходять за межі кабіни.
Remote control. Is it possible to have this harvesting with remote control? That's the question, I think.
It's not being done currently. I could see people being interested in that in the future, but not at present.
Можемо рухатися далі. Колеги, я пропоную...
Okay,
що
let's continue. Dear colleagues, maybe let's ask one more question from the chat and then we can continue with the presentation. We have a question from Ivan Shishkan. It's from the reserved area. He is writing that in the Ukrainian Carpathians, the climate changes cause a serious impact for the fir trees. And do you see such changes in terms of coniferous trees in the US in connection with the climate change?
We are starting to see that. We are starting to see a lot of drought, which is causing insects and mortality. And we are seeing hotter, drier summers. And that, along with the our past wildfire strategies, has resulted in the last decade with some very large, very destructive wildfires. And so part of what we're trying to do is to get out ahead of wildfires and thin the forest to try to help it withstand wildfires better.
Мені здається, що питання стосувалося більше про усихання, не про вигорання.
So, the question was about
Якщо можна, власне, про всихання якогось деревного виду.
drying out of some species, tree species. Do you see such a phenomenon? Because the climate change causes really some phenomena that our scientists say that the fir trees become too dry, but there is no scientific ground.
So that's not my area of expertise, but I do know that there has been tree mortality due to dry, hotter conditions.
Пане Іване, я пропоную, що ми це запитання адресуємо нашим колегам в лісовій службі. І
Okay,
вони
Ivan, I think we'd better ask our colleagues because this is not the Lisa's area of expertise. We see another question in the chat from Boris Boychuk. He's writing that it is very difficult to get the permission for harvesting the affected trees. So sanitary logging. Is it possible to log such trees in the reserved areas in the US, provided that these trees have been affected by some diseases, for instance?
There are some challenges because we have a lot of our public who are very opinionated, but might not have a lot of forestry knowledge. And some groups do not want to see any tree cut anytime, and they are vocal. But we are, with the wildfires that have been happening, we are getting more public to agree to cut the timber. And logistically, we can get the trees out. It's policy if we can get that agreement with the public.
Ага, тут мені нагадують. Дякую, Лісо, за запитання.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your question. Okay, dear colleagues, let's continue with the presentation. Miss Irina, I will look for your question and we will keep it for the next Q&A session, okay?
All right.
Because we still have large portion of presentation ahead of us. So let's continue, okay?
Yes. So the next systems that I'm going to be talking about are cable systems. So if we talk cable, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but I am going to talk about tongue throwing over here, and skyline, which is the most common system that we have in the US, and just a little bit about a variant known as multi-span. So with cable systems, you have some type of a tower to provide lift for the logs as they come in, so they're not just dragging on the ground. We do the skyline in places where it's too steep for the ground-based logging. Because it does cost about twice as much to log with a cable system versus a ground-based system. There's very strict requirements on where the road needs to go in order to make this system work. And so they require a lot more planning from the forester's perspective on where those roads will go and where that machine will sit. These systems can be used with any silviculture prescription, so both clear cuts or thinnings. This system, as I mentioned, is more expensive than ground-based, but it's about half the cost of helicopter yarding, which is another method that gets used in some places. And so here's a diagram. You have your yarder on the road. It needs to have, well, most of them need to have stumps to help hold the tower up. You have lines that go out and tie off to trees out in the woods. And you have another smaller machine that goes out, will grab the logs, and then a rope is used to pull it back to the road. The multi-span option is basically where you use a tree in the middle of the unit to keep this line up in the air so that you can reach further with this system. The topology or how the land is shaped really affects how far you can reach in grabbing logs. So yarders is the machine that we use that sits at the landing at the road. In the past, they were purpose-built yarders. During the 80s, a lot of these were made. Sometimes they can move a little bit, kind of changes where they're most efficient, if they're standing or if they can rotate to pile the logs, say in the road like this. But very, very few of these are built anymore, expressly or just for the purpose of logging. Now, most of the machines we use as yarders were actually some other type of machine that loggers make modifications to so that they can act as a yarder. So we have a yoder and we have a excaliner are just now yarders that started as a different piece of machine originally. Another method for getting the logs out for shorter areas of say about 90 meters is jammers, or also known as tong throwing. And so you have the tongs here attached to a rope, and this machine will start swinging around and then release the brake, and the tongs go flying out into the woods. Someone in the woods will put those tongs around a log, and then it will be dragged back to the road, as you see here. So this will throw them out into the woods, and you have a very brave person out in the woods watching these, very heavy tongs come flying towards them. They will put them on the log and then they will be dragged back. So those are our cable systems that are used in the US predominantly. And then I'm going to talk just briefly about helicopter systems. So this is a system that is used in some areas where the trees have a high enough value or there's a big desire to treat that stand. So here was the first helicopter flight in the US, pictured here. But this helicopter, you have a long line coming underneath the helicopter with a hook and something to measure the weight. And so, because you overload the helicopter or it will crash. So they need to be very careful about how much weight they put on that helicopter. Flying tops and limbs is very expensive and they don't want to do that. It costs about 4 times as much as your ground-based systems and about twice as much as a cable system. These machines can cost up to $8,000 US per hour to operate, and it is a very expensive system. It is also a very dangerous system because you have helicopters, you have them carrying weights, heavy weight. You have people working underneath the helicopter. It can also be noisy if you have wildlife, especially birds that are sensitive to noise. It can impact them. However, it can be used in any terrain. As long as you are removing a fair amount of trees, it can be used with any desired stand result. It requires fewer roads, which a lot of our environmental groups prefer. And it can be used in areas where you have visual concerns or no other road access. Okay, so the second half of my presentation, I'm going to go a lot more in depth into tethered logging, which is just starting to take off in the United States, as well as Europe and New Zealand, and is probably going to replace a lot of cable systems here over the next couple decades. But before I get into that, are there any questions about cable systems or helicopter?
Чи є запитання у присутніх?
Any questions from the audience?
Ми маємо 2 запитання.
Okay, let's go ahead. We have 2 questions in the chat. They are not specifically about helicopter or cable systems, but rather general. But maybe we can cover those and then we go on. Okay. Ірина Шпаківська asked this question. If there are large areas of the territories of deadfall territories, so what methods are used then? And I see Volodymyr's hand.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you repeat that?
The question was if you have large areas of windfalls. What approach, what machinery do you use? What systems do you use?
For that, if it's less than 40%, we found the cut to length system works well because the machine can pick up the logs and get the branches and pile them easily and kind of sort through them. If it's on the steeper ground, if we can reach it with a cable system, we will. You know, last resort would be helicopter.
Тобто я просто уточню
Let me
відповідь. Це залежить не від
just summarize. It depends not so much on the territory of this windfall, on the area of that fall, but rather on the landscape, on other conditions, right? On the slope, the tilt, and so on and so forth.
Дякую. Тут є ще одне
Okay,
запитання.
thank you. We have another question. If I may, I read this question first, Volodymyr, and this is about the part of the presentation that you presented previously and the one that goes next, I believe, because the question is, where do you train forestry machinery operators, and if they need special permits to work with these mechanisms, including cable systems? Where are they trained and if they need permits?
So as the Forest Service, we own the land. We don't do any logging ourselves. We hire loggers to do that. And so the loggers do the training. They are usually working with whatever company makes the equipment. So whatever, you know, company makes the equipment, helps train the loggers on that equipment, but the logger is responsible for that.
І чи потрібні на це спеціальні
What
дозволи?
about permits, if they need special permits for that?
Якщо ви знаєте.
They don't need permits to be a logger. Obviously, if they're working on our ground, they need a contract with us. But there are no permits required to be a logger or to operate different machinery. There are rules about safety, but permitting is not one of those rules.
Дякую, Ліса.
Thank
Володимир,
you, Lisa. Volodymyr, go ahead.
Ще раз кажу, орієнтовно.
Yes, again, approximately. Can you compare so how much cable systems, what is the proportion of cable systems that you use in general?
So it varies a lot. For example, the state I live in Oregon, half the state, there are no cable loggers at all because it's drier and the trees are not worth very much. On the other half of the state, there's a lot more rain. The trees grow bigger and it's generally steeper with the mountains, and probably 70% of the ground is cable logged.
ви зрозуміли, так, Володимир Леонідович?
You got it, right?
Тоді що роблять харвестери?
Okay.
Провадили
What do harvesters, forwarders, skitters, and so on and so forth, do you use them at all?
Yes, so on the shallower grounds, you know, it's a lot of the feller bunchers and the skitters.
Так, дякую.
Дякуємо.
Okay, thank you. Can we move on?
Yes.
Let's go to proceed with the next system. That's a very interesting part of the presentation. I believe many people will be surprised now. Okay.
Yes, so I have quite a bit here to share about tethered logging because it is new. It's been around maybe 15 years in total. It started in New Zealand and it's found its way into Europe and to the United States. And it's been in the United States for about a decade now. And we call it tethered logging, or sometimes winch assist.
Володимир Леонідович, виключіть, будь ласка, мікрофон. Володимир Леонідович.
That's the request. Mute.
And
Okay.
so with tethered logging, we're using ground-based machines that normally wouldn't go above a 40% slope onto steeper ground that would normally be cable logged. And so you have your machine and it's out operating on, 70 or even 80% slopes. Sometimes we do it, like the loggers do it just for cutting the trees and still cable log, or sometimes they will fell the trees and also remove them with this tethered system. And so the harvesters, feller bunchers, directional fellers, forwarders, shovels, skidders, all of these have been used tethered in the last few years and are ongoing. So this tethered logging, you're basically using a winch to help this machine get up and down the slope. Because it's on a steeper slope, it wouldn't be able to operate on this area, if not well, but there'll be a winch to help it get up and down this slope. As I mentioned, it's only been around for about 10 years in the United States. It's mostly been used on private ground because it's a lot safer for the employees and it's more cost effective than cable yarding. We're slowly starting to incorporate it in Forest Service harvests. We were slow to adapt it because we still have concerns about putting this equipment on these steep slopes and how that's going to impact the soil. So an analogy or a comparison for what this is, imagine you have a vehicle that is stuck in the snow and you try to drive and your wheels just spin and you don't go anywhere. If you bring in another vehicle and if you try to pull with this one, but don't try to drive this one, these tires will spin and your stuck vehicle will go nowhere. But if you try to drive both vehicles at the same time, you can get the vehicle that is stuck out of the ditch. That's kind of what's happening with this tethered system. It's designed to help, but it's not going to pull the whole machine. It's there to help the machine that's operating in the woods. There are two main different types of tethered logging. The one is if you just have one machine and you have the winch that is on that machine. Right now, Hanze is the only one who is doing this. They are a Finnish company based out of Finland. And they do harvesters and forwarders, so a cut to length system. But this is it's a very neat system because the winch is on the machine. They just tie off to any, tree that's, big enough, and they can just be tied off in the steep areas. And if they get to a flat area, they can then unconnect from that tree. This line doesn't move. It just, the rope comes off of your winch here as it goes down and then gets rolled back up as the machine comes back up the hill. So again, Hanze is the only one currently doing this method for cut to length systems. Oh. Well, our picture got a little, took over our presentation, but that's okay.
Один слайд би треба удалити, тому що він перекрив.
You should remove one slide because it completely covers the picture with the first method.
Maybe if you just delete the
Yeah,
picture.
so.
Because that's, I guess, the picture that I had difficulties with, and I inserted it today. So maybe it went, it covered the slide.
That's okay.
I'm sorry for that.
No problem. So the other method is where you have two machines. So you have the winch on a machine that will stay at the road. And then you have the machine that will go out into the woods. So we call this one the working machine because it's doing all the work. And we call this one the assisting machine, the one with the winch on it. Because the winch is on this machine that stays stationary, this line does move when this machine goes out into the woods. So, one of the reasons, as I mentioned, this is starting to really gain a lot of use is that it improves safety and putting them into equipment cabs that are approved by our National Safety Department. Because you don't have people out cutting with chainsaws or being working under the yarder, and they are instead in cabs, it is a lot safer for them. And these systems have reduced soil impacts as compared to putting the same machines on a slope untethered. And so efficiency goes up because the machines are doing the work instead of someone on the ground. So you can see here, we have forwarders, shovels, even skidders can be used with this tethered system. And so it allows for fully authorized, fully mechanical yarding. So a question that people ask when they first see this tends to be, how steep can they go? How steep of a slope can you put these machines? A better question is actually to ask, well, how steep should they go? So this is not one of our operations. This is a picture taken somewhere in Asia, I believe. But this is steeper than we would want to see on our logging sites. And how steep they should go, a lot of that's going to depend on soil impacts. So there's slope. It's also going to depend on your soil type, the trees and bushes and plants that you have left on site, the skill of the person working the machine, whether the weather and ground conditions, and then the access for the machines and the anchors, such as trees, to be able to anchor these machines too. So equipment on slopes over 40% cause concerns with soil due to displacement and rutting. That's usually caused by the machines spinning their wheels. They don't go anywhere and they can dig deeper and cause soil impacts. So this is what happens when you go get off the road with a piece of machinery that is not tethered, and it starts to slide and cause soil problems, which then become worse when you try to get back up the hill onto the road. So this is why we don't take equipment untethered onto these steeper slopes, because you start getting soil impacts like this. But when you tether, it actually changes the weight and how that happens on the equipment. And so if they are not tethered, all of the weight ends up focused on the downhill part of the machine, in this circumstance on the tracks. And this is where that soil damage will occur, because all the weight is right here. When you add a tether in on this line, the weight is more evenly put onto the ground. It gives better traction, and you get reduced soil impacts because of that. So one of our universities, Oregon State University, did some studies on this, and they put sensors underneath the machine to measure what the ground pressure is under these tracks. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but basically this is the machine facing uphill with the boom, the arm on the machine, in or out, facing downhill with the boom out. The main thing I want you to focus on here is not get too bogged down into the details, but this blue line at the bottom is the ground pressure of this upper portion of the track. So basically right here is the blue line, and then the red line is going to be this part of the track here. So that blue line, there is almost no ground pressure. That track is barely touching the ground versus the top or the bottom of the track, this red line, where you're getting a lot of ground pressure. That's just showing, you know, mathematically that that's where all that weight is. When we tether, there's a little bit of increase on the top of that track, but as you can see, the weight on the bottom part of that track right here is greatly reduced. So instead of all the weight being here and none here, it's more evenly distributed. And that allows for better traction, allows for the machine to operate, causing less soil damage. So on steep ground, more of that weight is on the downhill side, causing soil damage. When we tether, it reduces those soil impacts because the whole length of the track is in contact with the ground. Do you have questions about the physics of how that tethering works and how it helps to reduce soil impacts?
В нас є одне запитання, яке стосується
We have a question about the tethering system,
воно стосується охорони праці.
but it's rather about occupational safety. So are there any occupational safety rules for defining the distance between the tethered machines?
No, the safety organizations, agencies are looking at safety of these operations, but I have not heard of any concerns about how close those pieces of equipment are to each other. In part because there's only one operator in the working machine. The assisting machine, the one that stays at the road, there's nobody in that machine. It is remote controlled by the operator in the working machine.
Дякую, Лісо, за відповідь.
Thank you,
У нас
Lisa.
два запитання
We
від
have two
Бориса
more
Бойчука.
questions from Mr. Boris Boychuk.
Яка вартість окремої
First, what is the
техніки,
cost
які
of
завжди прив'язані
the
до
equipment and
екскаватора?
machines,
Це одне
including the
питання.
tethered
Будівельники
shovel
мають
machines?
техніку,
That's
яку
one question.
можливо
And the question is
великі
whether
компанії,
the
які здають в оренду спеціалізовану
harvesters
техніку. І це друге
have
питання
their
стосується
own
не тільки
equipment and
примусової
machines,
техніки,
or maybe there
будівельної
are
техніки
big
загалом.
companies that provide the equipment for rent.
So that's a great segment, great moving into what I'll be talking next, which is getting a little bit more into the equipment. So hold that question, and if I don't answer it here in the next few slides, ask it again. The price, so a new system, say like the Ponze, is very expensive. A harvester and forwarder for tethered logging from Ponze with the winch is between $1.5 and $2 million US. So it's very, very expensive. A lot of the loggers don't have that kind of money or don't want to spend that kind of money. And so they are taking their existing equipment And for about $100, maybe $200,000, they can add a winch to their existing equipment. But if you compare for a unit, the cost of, you know, the cost of your labor, your people, and the production, the cost per cubic meter of volume harvested is just slightly more than a normal ground-based system and way less than a cable system. So it has a very large upfront cost, but it has a lot of ongoing savings because you have a crew of 2 people instead of 10, and they can be more productive.
Дякую, Лісо. Тоді рухаємося далі.
Thank you, Lisa, and let's go on.
Okay. So as for the assisting machines, a lot of times we'll use a excavator, a large machinery. You can see they added the winch here. And these stay at the road. A lot of times they will tie off to a tree as well, but they stay at the road while the other machine goes out into the woods. There is no one in this machine. The winch is operated by the person that's down in the other machine, the working machine. There are also some machines built just to be an assisting machine, such as this one. So it's not another piece of machinery changed. It is designed just for this and has the winch and wire rope in here. These are often tied off to a tree to help them stay and not get pulled down the slope with the other machine. And these are again controlled by this operator. The most common machine that we're seeing being used tethered is the directional fellers and feller buncher. One, because it replaces a lot of people with chainsaws, which is one of the more dangerous jobs. It's also one of the jobs that we're having a harder time, loggers are having a harder time finding people with those skills and who want to work in that job, especially because it is dangerous. This also allows for the logs to be put in piles, which if they're cable logged, you can cable log more effectively, or you can also then use another method, such as skidders or shovel. So this is the most common tethered machine we're seeing at present. And I have a video to show of a tethered directional feller for you. So this machine is designed to just cut one tree at a time and then place it in a pile for another machine to take up to the road. These can cut trees up to not quite a meter in diameter, probably just under a meter. Is the size of tree they can cut. There's the winch line that's on that machine. So shovels, these are the ones that move the cut logs by picking them up and moving them closer to your road. And so the nice thing is your directional feller that we just saw can also be used as a shovel. And so you might have a machine that goes down and it cuts all the trees as it goes down. And then it ends up moving all the trees back to the road as it works its way up the hill. So this is a up close of what that looks like. And there's a chainsaw in the bottom, which it uses to cut the trees. And here's a video of watching after it is that same machine that we just saw cutting the trees. And it is now shovel logging the logs back up the hill. So that was a good example that on steeper slopes, logs like to slide down the hill. And that will happen, you know, in normal operations with just humans out there as well. And that's another one of the main safety factors that causes a lot of injuries and deaths is logs sliding down and hitting people working in the woods. And so when you have someone in a cab like this, it alleviates, gets rid of that safety hazard. So harvesters and forwarders, actually this is where the technology started, was in New Zealand on harvesters and forwarders. So both of them can be tethered. If the winches are on the machines, like you see here, they will definitely, well, they pretty much always start from the top and work their way down. The forwarder will always have the cab on the downhill side because there's a metal wall here so that the logs rest on it. Otherwise, if you're facing the other way, all the logs would slide off. So harvesters and forwarders work great as a tethered cut to length operation. And again, if they're the Ponzes, they don't need another machine. It's just one machine and one machine to cut, one machine to forward, and they tie off 2 stumps. And here's another video of a cut to length for you. Now it's a little bit of a long video, but I find it really helps people to get a visual and to understand the system better with the videos. So you can still cable yard in some areas if you don't want to put a skidder or a forwarder on the landscape, but you still want to have some increased efficiency and safety. So send a feller buncher or directional feller to cut down the trees. And then place all the cut trees underneath the cable. And then instead of wire ropes and people needing to put those wire ropes on the logs to get them to come out, you can put a grapple down. And there's cameras mounted on this machine. And it will go down and grab bunches of logs at once. So you can still have some increased safety and efficiency while still using a cable system. So some things to think about that are unique to tethered. There will need to be a trail every 15 meters because the boom on the machines can only reach out about 7-8 meters. And so 7-8 meters on either side, you'll need a trail every 15 meters or so. Those trails need to be up and down the hill. You do not want to be on a side because you could roll over. So you want to go straight up and down the hill. Although with these systems, you can kind of go down a hill and then put in a block and turn and go down, say the side of the hill, as long as you're still going up and down and not risking rolling over. So a lot of our forests in the Forest Service are trying to write our environmental documents to allow for this type of operation, but not require it because it is still not something that even half of our operators have. It's definitely growing in popularity, but it's not something that everyone has. So we're not requiring this, but we are trying to allow for it to happen. So in summary, it allows us to take ground-based operations onto slopes that we would never consider allowing ground-based operations on before, and that would have had to be cable logged. They are easier to think about how you will get to the trees cut and to the road, because when you're cable logging, there's a lot of requirements on exactly where the road needs to go, and ground that's very uneven is very challenging to reach with the cable systems, and you don't have to worry about any of that with this tethered system. And it's a lot more flexible on where you can put your roads. Maybe if you have other environmental concerns on where you don't want a road, that's a lot more flexible. Borders and shovels can take the timber up and down to reduce the amount of roads you have. So I know there was a question from earlier. Did I answer that, or do I need to go back to it? You're muted.
У нас були питання від пана Бориса. Ліса питає, чи варто
Yes,
нам
we had a question from Boris, and the question is whether Boris received the answer from the rest of presentation. I would still have some questions in the chat.
поки пан Борис думає,
Okay, while
відповіли на його
Boris is
питання
considering this information, let me read the question from Yuri. It's the question about
Доброго дня. Чи це роботи з підвищеною безпекою?
safety.
Відсоток травмування?
What is the percentage of occupational traumas and injuries during these hazardous works?
Oh, I would have to look it up, but I do know the normal logging is just about the most dangerous. It's number one or number two. It goes back and forth. dangerous jobs in the United States. And I know that putting people in equipment cuts the fatality rate down from over half. So you have less than half or maybe down to a quarter deaths as compared to a normal logging.
І друге запитання наше.
The second question. Thank you for your answer. So the question is whether there are cases of tilting and damaging this equipment in the logging areas. If such cases take place, who compensates the cost for fixing these machines? And is there any insurance system?
Yes, so I haven't heard of any equipment damaged because it's tethered. I'm sure there's been some situations. The loggers do have insurance on their equipment. If something is to happen to them, that they go out and get from companies that specifically insure loggers.
Дякую, Лісо. І в нас Володимир Леонідович.
Thank you, Lisa. And there is a question from Volodymyr. He has raised his hand.
Ну, у мене традиційне питання.
I have quite a traditional question.
Такої техніки,
What is the percentage
що прив'язується до
of
стовбів чи прив'язується
machines
до
being
стовбів,
tethered to
використовується
the supports?
Чи це як експерименти, чи
No, unfortunately, the sound is very poor.
в такому широкому застосуванні? Приблизно 5-10% від загальної кількості техніки, що працює на лісозаготівлі. Який процент
So what
складає,
is the percentage
як ви називаєте, прив'язувальна чи
of
прив'язана техніка
tethered equipment?
від загальної
So
кількості
hard
So from the total, yes. What's the percentage of the tethered equipment or equipment used within the within the tethering systems?
So what I've seen is especially on private lands, the percentage of tethered is going up a lot every year. I don't know the total amount, but I guess we're getting close to almost half of what used to be cable logged is now being tethered. Might not be that high yet, but it's going up quite a bit every year. Most of that has been with, say, feathered bunchers, and then maybe cable yarded. Although there's one operator doing the cut to length with Ponzes, and he's buying probably 2 harvesters and 2 forwarders every year, and just continues to get larger and larger, working all over the nation. It's very hard to get a feel for what's happening because everyone's making their own individual decisions from the logger's perspective on what machines they have, how much money they have, and how fast they want to adapt to this new technology. This is still pretty rare on Forest Service lands. And I would say maybe 5% on Forest Service lands.
Я чого задав це питання?
Let me explain why I'm asking this question. 13 years ago,
Оператора Харвестера
I was standing
свою лебідку і
behind the harvest operator who used this tethering method. It was 13 years ago. And the last year, an Austrian Forestry Institute, for the first time, made an experiment with the use of such a tethering technique. It's a very promising technique, but I think loggers need time to master it. Thank you for your question. Thank you, Lisa, for your answers. So actually, as far as we see, we have arrived at the conclusion of our webinar. If you still have questions, please do not hesitate to ask them. We've got 1 or 2 minutes left. Yes, Lisa has a question. I have a rather general question. Lisa, given your experience, if we look at our Carpathian Mountains, which are used for selective harvesting or thinning harvesting. So what recommendations can be given for harvesting and transportation with due consideration of sustainability of solutions? So in the Carpathians, if we are going to ensure thinning logging, then what techniques, what solutions can be applied?
So anything I've talked about, probably other than shovel, is something that could be done. Now, looking forward, the tethering is where pretty much everyone is going. Depending on what you want to do with your limbs and tops, if you want them left in the woods, then the cut to length is a good system. If you want all that taken out of the woods, then probably something with a feller buncher. And I understand that you guys used to have some yarders, but those have all pretty much gone away, and you only have maybe 1 or 2 left, is my understanding. So trying to bring that in would be very challenging. So I think looking at the tethered options, it's kind of where everyone else is going in Europe, in New Zealand, in the United States. It's very forgiving for where your road locations are. And so I would say look at your silviculture of what you want left to figure out what machines work best, especially with what budget you have, what money you have to spend, and what you want to have happen with your stand when you're done.
Дякуємо, Лісо, дякуємо всім.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks to all the participants today. Let me remind you that next week, on the 9th of May, our next webinar will be on requirements and storing of the New York catchment basin. We will talk to Chris Brown, and he will share the best management practices in the context of preventing the flakes and residue finding its way to water bodies. So thank you all for participation today. We're strict on time. I see that some people started disconnecting a bit earlier, but that's okay. And thank you all. If you wish to say something, you're welcome. We can allocate a couple of minutes more for your feedback if you want to share something particular, your ideas. Yuri, I see a hand. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Lisa, for the very interesting presentation. I believe it is really interesting because the state agency, together with Forests of Ukraine state-owned enterprise, announced the procurement of modern equipment for forestry. Most likely, these are going to be harvesters, forwarders, maybe not that much cable systems. However, there are things that we need to work on. And to some extent, well, we need to emphasize that back in 2017, recommendations were developed to improve logging under various settings in the Ukrainian Carpathians. But those are recommendations about the harvester and forwarder-based technologies, as Lisa actually presented today, and also using chainsaws and mobile installations, but these are recommendations for the mountainous part. And now we will probably mostly focus on those methods and technologies to recover forests in the east that have been affected. So harvesters and forwarders will rather be used in those settings, and we don't have guidelines there. I believe Volodymyr will agree with me that even his guidelines, his institution's guidelines, they do not contain as detailed information as presented by Lisa today on various systems of logging. And thus, it makes sense to review these recommendations and maybe come up with specific guidelines for mountains and for flat terrains. There was this interesting question from Irina that asked the question about windfalls and whether this equipment can be used there. Since we have OSH rules in forestry that regulate working on windfalls, but again, these are mostly rules that are focused on use of man-force. So this is not so much about machines. And this technology, as the method as presented by Lisa today, it's very interesting for us to come up with these ideas on how to minimize the costs, how to better combine machines, which machines could be most applicable for our needs in the mountains and on flat plains, because we should expect quite a lot of work in forests associated with demining. And thus, I asked those questions about insurance and stuff, because this is expensive. And these are expensive machines. And if you combine them, it is double or triple cost. And of course, there are high risks of damage in the course of demining. So this information is very interesting and helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yuri. Volodymyr? To add to what Yuri has said, I'd like to say thank you, Ms. Lisa, again for this very interesting information and for this innovations and ideas that are really new also at the European level, not only in Ukraine. That's all very interesting, and I believe that decision makers at the state-owned enterprise here should have access to this information, because that could form the basis for, could inform decision-making on procurement of certain types of equipment. Regarding the machines that are tied, that use the winch method, well, it's clear that this is efficient and required only in the mountains. However, again, this is very interesting and helpful. Thank you so much. And about the things that the Institute has already implemented, it is clear that each time equipment is upgraded, updated, and of course we need to come up with new guidelines. Thank you.
Дякую, Володимир Леонідович.
Thank you, Volodymyr,
За ваш коментар і ваші
for your
запити.
comment and for your feedback.
Будь ласка, якщо ще хтось хоче висловитися,
Anyone else who would like to
вмикайте.
speak up, you're welcome.
Бажаємо всім гарного дня.
Okay, then have a good day today. Have a good evening,
Який час доби.
depending on your time of the day.
До зустрічі на
And see you soon.
наступному вебінарі.
See you at the next webinar. Bye.
Всім до побачення і до зустрічі в наступний вівторок.
Goodbye. See you next week.